On May 22, 1968, at some point in the North Atlantic, a submarine that had lived for years in the silence of the ocean emitted what would be its last audible signal to the world on the surface. USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered submarine and a source of pride for the United States Navy, was sailing toward her home port in Norfolk after a routine mission, apparently without incident, with no visible signs of serious deterioration, and without any prior alert that might anticipate what was about to happen. When the hours passed, then the days, and finally the weeks, the absence turned into a void that neither logic nor protocol could fill. The families of the 99 crew members waited for news that never seemed to arrive, while the Navy deployed an operation that, on the outside, looked like a simple search effort, but on the inside carried the weight of a secret that could not be revealed without putting strategic assets at risk in the midst of the Cold War. By the end of May, dozens of ships and aircraft traced search patterns over an ocean that seemed unwilling to give up its answers. But the real investigation was not taking place there, but in a silent, hermetic, guarded laboratory where a handful of analysts studied an extremely sensitive recording obtained from the SOSUS network, a system of hydrophones placed on the seabed to detect the passage of Soviet submarines. On May 22nd, that network had picked up 15 acoustic events spread over a little more than 3 minutes. They were brief, dense, low-frequency sounds, interpreted by some as signs of a collapse, by others as indications of an explosion, and by all as indisputable evidence that something completely irreversible had happened in the depths. The information was there, in the form of vibrations that were practically undecipherable without specialized equipment. But publicly revealing that the Navy could listen to and analyze events taking place thousands of meters below the surface would be equivalent to exposing the existence of a strategic asset designed to monitor every move of the enemy. That is why, while the official search followed protocol guidelines, the real search followed mathematics and secrecy. Statistical models were refined, probability maps redrawn, and John Craven, a key figure in the Navy's special projects, adjusted what would become the heart of the search: the projection of the hull collapse point based on the energy recorded by the hydrophones. Days went by, then months. In October, when public hope had slowly faded, USNS Mizar moved through a reduced sector of the ocean, guided by those calculations that were never openly explained. On board, a towed camera descended to almost 3,000 meters of depth, passing through a dark and silent world where the pressure is capable of turning steel into paper. When the first images returned to the surface, what they revealed was not a spectacular discovery, but the confirmation of what analysts had feared since May. The submarine lay destroyed, fragmented, spread out in 2 large sections, separated by a field of debris that told the story of a tragedy that had unfolded in a matter of seconds. The hull of USS Scorpion, designed to withstand tremendous pressures, seemed to have failed at its most vulnerable point. The area around frame 33 showed signs of having been the first to give way. The collapse progressed rapidly toward the conical cylindrical transition of the hull, around frame 67. The physics of the ocean does not forgive. When the structural limit was exceeded, the vessel was subjected to forces so intense that the engineering section telescoped forward nearly 15 meters, folding like tin under tons of invisible but relentless pressure. The propulsion shaft detached, not because it had been expelled by an explosion, but because the structure around it had compressed to the point that it had no other path to follow. The forward section, by contrast, told a different story. The torpedo compartment, an area many suspected as the origin of the tragedy, was surprisingly well preserved compared to the rest. It had suffered deformations, yes, but it did not show the characteristic signs of an internal detonation. The walls were not blown outward. There were no traces of a sudden expansive pressure. The most significant detail was the absence of the forward escape trunk hatch, torn away by external pressure when the room was already flooded. That detail, small in appearance, carried enormous weight. It showed that the space had equalized pressure before the final collapse, which almost completely ruled out the possibility that an explosion in the compartment had initiated the disaster. The forensic analysis of the hull created a solid technical consensus. The submarine had not been destroyed by an internal or external explosion. There were no signs of an enemy attack. There were no impact marks, no traces of charges, no fractures typical of a sudden collision with an external object. What happened was simple in its physics, terrible in its consequences. An uncontrolled ingress of water at some point in the pressure hull caused an increase in weight that led the submarine to descend beyond its maximum operating depth. When it exceeded its limit, the pressure of the ocean destroyed it in thousandths of a second. The crew never had the chance to react. However, the cause of that water ingress still divides experts and analysts. Some theories point to the waste disposal system, a complex conduit located in the midsection of the submarine, whose failure could allow direct entry of water into the compartments. Others point to electrical problems derived from hydrogen buildup in the batteries, and others, less credible but persistent, suggest scenarios involving defective torpedoes whose accidental activation forced the crew to carry out maneuvers that eventually compromised the submarine's stability. But none of those hypotheses has managed to fully encompass the entire acoustic record and the structural information in a completely satisfactory way. The most insistent case is that of the Mark 37 torpedo, whose battery had a history of overheating. If a thermal reaction had triggered a fire or even a small burst in its compartment, it could have caused confusion or local damage. But even so, it would not explain the sequence of 15 acoustic events, nor the preservation of the torpedo compartment, which would have been the most affected. On the other hand, the theory of a Soviet attack, repeated so many times in conspiracy circles, simply does not fit any piece of concrete evidence. There are no impacts, no penetrations, no traces of fragmentation. And what is more, from a tactical standpoint, in 1968, the Soviets did not have the capability to approach, track, and attack American submarines of that class without being detected. Even so, for decades the families of the crew had to live with the weight of multiple contradictory versions, while the Navy kept certain reports in reserve. Not out of malice, but because of the inevitable contradiction between transparency and the protection of the country's strategic capabilities. When, finally, in 1993, partial findings from the investigation were released, what became clear was simple. The submarine was lost due to a sequence of failures that still cannot be fully reconstructed, but whose outcome is unequivocal. Its end was a collapse under pressure, not an explosion. Its last seconds were silent, swift, impossible to stop. The exact location of the hull, nearly 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores, remains protected. The Navy periodically revisits the site, not to look for new answers, but to ensure that the submarine has not been disturbed, and to monitor any possible leakage from the nuclear reactor, or from the 2 nuclear-armed torpedoes it carried on board. To this day, uranium measurements have not revealed anything outside the range expected from atmospheric nuclear dust accumulated since the mid-20th century. The story of USS Scorpion remains, despite everything, a permanent duality. One part is the mystery of what initiated the tragedy, and the other is the absolute certainty of how it ended. A symbol of vulnerability at the heart of the Cold War, a reminder that even machines designed to withstand the unthinkable remain subject to the implacable laws of the ocean. In the end, Scorpion was not brought down by a visible enemy, nor by a monumental error, nor by an explicit oversight. It fell victim to the most fearsome combination in the submarine world, an unexpected failure and the absolute silence of the deep. As the years passed after the tragedy, what remained of USS Scorpion ceased to be only a technical mystery, and also became a point of reflection for entire generations of engineers, sailors, historians, and families who never received a final answer. What happened on the bottom of the Atlantic continued to resonate not only in the archived reports, but also in the collective memory of the submarine service, a community where every loss is felt as a shared wound. The documents that were finally released in the 1990s recounted specific facts, measured and written with military precision. But beneath those pages, there was a deeper story. The psychological weight of searching for the truth in a setting where the ocean keeps more secrets than it gives up. The wreckage found showed a sequence as clear as it was painful. The collapse of the hull had occurred in a matter of milliseconds, without the crew having time to understand that they had crossed the point of no return. When a submarine descends beyond its crushed depth, steel is no longer enough to hold back the ocean. The pressure increases exponentially, not linearly, and any imperfection, crack, or weakened point becomes the origin of a collapse that travels at the speed of sound along the structure. Simulations carried out decades later demonstrated that if USS Scorpion crossed its crushed depth, none of the sailors would have had an instant to react. Many of the experts involved in later studies agreed that death would have been instantaneous. While the technical analyses continued to focus on the physical cause, others began to focus on the historical context. USS Scorpion was part of a fleet that operated under constant tension. These were years in which each mission could contain elements of espionage, tracking, surveillance, and tactical response. American and Soviet submarines played a silent game in the ocean, a game in which detection meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant danger. Every maneuver, every transmission, and every decision had geopolitical implications larger than the ships themselves. In that environment, the loss of a nuclear submarine was not only a human tragedy, but also an unsettling reminder of what could happen if a technical failure struck at the worst possible moment. One of the areas where attention was focused was the maintenance and operating culture of the time. Although USS Scorpion had passed inspections before setting sail, some internal sources indicated that the submarine had been carrying problems for months. There were reports of unusual vibrations, minor failures in electrical systems, and recurring difficulties in hydraulic components. None of those failures was catastrophic in itself, but a sequence of minor failures in the hostile environment of the deep ocean can become a fatal chain. For later analyses, the question was no longer only what failed, but whether the submarine should have been sent back to sea without a more thorough overhaul. That aspect, never officially clarified, became one of the most persistent shadows of the case. What was found on the seabed reinforced many of those concerns. The pattern of debris dispersion indicated that the submarine had descended along a relatively controlled trajectory until the final moments. This suggested that the crew may have been trying to fight an ingress of water, attempting to contain it, isolate compartments, or stabilize buoyancy. But if the water entered at a point that linked several internal zones, the effort would have been futile. The increase in weight, even in small amounts, can alter the stability of the submarine quickly. And if, in addition, the ballast system or electrical controls were affected by the ingress of water, the ability to ascend would have disappeared almost immediately. For many experts, the most likely scenario is not an explosive event or a hostile act, but a quieter internal sequence, a valve that fails, a worn seal, an overheating that compromises cables, a leak in a conduit that allows the initial entry of water. In a submarine, just a few liters of water in the wrong place can affect critical electrical systems. A pump that stops, a panel that floods, a switchboard that cuts out. All of this, under hundreds of meters of pressure, can be lethal. If the water ingress was fast enough and occurred in an intermediate compartment, the submarine could have lost the ability to control its angle and slid downward at an angle impossible to correct. Meanwhile, the acoustic record captured by SOSUS remained the most enigmatic piece of all. The 15 recorded signals were not homogeneous, did not correspond to a clear detonation, and did not come from a single point. They were pulses, creaks, structural collapses, fragmentations. Each sound seemed to represent a different moment in the whole collapse, from the first structural failures to the final destruction. Most unsettling for some analysts was the timeline. The record suggested a sustained sequence, as if the submarine had been coming apart gradually before reaching the point where everything ended suddenly. That sequence gave rise to interpretations which, although never confirmed, hinted that the crew might have been aware of an emergency for several minutes before the end. In the years that followed, as more documents were declassified, another important element emerged: the emotional complexity of the case. Many of the crew's relatives expressed that the greatest pain was not only the loss, but the silence that surrounded it for decades. The authorities could not share details for strategic reasons, but that secrecy fed parallel theories, some reasonable, others improbable. There were those who insisted that USS Scorpion had been the victim of a secret confrontation. Others claimed that a defective torpedo might have armed its explosive device without human intervention. And others, less informed, sought mystical or extraordinary explanations. The truth is that the ocean rarely offers stories as clear as humanity expects. The case of Scorpion remains one where the data explains the end, but not the beginning. On the seabed, the scene revealed by the cameras was both technical and tragic. The crushed hull, the deformed panels, the scattered remains, all formed a silent narrative about the ship's final moments. The bow, preserved to a greater extent, seemed to observe the whole as a relic of a frozen moment in time. There were still recognizable hatches, fragments of piping that retained their shape, sections of the outer hull that still kept part of their original paint. Everything else had been reduced to crushed and twisted pieces by the pressure. The most striking feature was the clean separation between the forward and aft sections. There were no traces of an internal expansive force. There was no evidence that the hull had exploded outward. The fracture was consistent with an internal collapse due to uniform pressure. The aft section, where the engines were located, was the most destroyed, probably because water entered there first, accelerating the descent, compromising the structure, making any recovery maneuver impossible. As the submarine descended, the pressure increased to the point where internal systems collapsed simultaneously. Pipelines, bulkheads, supports, panels. Each part represented a different instant of the end. Studies carried out decades later, using much more advanced computer models, managed to recreate an approximation of the collapse. The results matched the historical findings: a rapid implosion, concentrated, silent from the outside, and completely devastating from the inside. The energy released in a pressure collapse of that type is equivalent to tons of force compressed into a confined space. It does not feel like an explosion, but like an absolute crushing, a sudden disappearance of all internal volume. For submarine engineers who study the resistance of steel, the case of Scorpion became a key example of how even a structure designed to withstand the inconceivable can fail if the sum of internal and external factors aligns at the worst possible moment. For decades afterwards, expeditions sent to the site of the sinking focused on two objectives: confirming the stability of the nuclear reactor and verifying that the nuclear-armed torpedoes remained in safe condition. Although later images showed superficial deterioration from the passage of time, chemical analyses did not reveal dangerous levels of radioactive material. Many experts attribute that absence of significant contamination to the robust containment engineering of the time, designed specifically to prevent an environmental disaster even in the event of sinking. The legacy of USS Scorpion was marked not only in military records, but also in submarine culture. For many sailors, it became an eternal reminder of the fragility of the balance in which submarines operate. They are extraordinary machines, capable of sailing in an environment where no human being can survive without the help of thousands of components working in perfect sync. But they are also vulnerable to minimal failures, pressure variations, maintenance problems, tiny errors that in the deep ocean are magnified to uncontrollable levels. Scorpion, along with USS Thresher, became a symbol of those harsh lessons. In recent years, new generations of researchers have revisited the case with modern technologies, from holographic analyses to hydrodynamic simulations. None has changed the main conclusion: The cause of the implosion remains uncertain, but the nature of the end is indisputable. An uncontrolled ingress of water initiated the sequence. An unstoppable descent accelerated it. Ocean pressure completed it. Death arrived in silence, without warning, without alarm, without any possibility of reaction. The story of USS Scorpion continues to be a reflection on the boundary between certainty and mystery. The ocean, with its silent immensity, kept the secret of the first instance. The acoustic analyzers revealed the final sequence. The structural remains confirmed the physics of the tragedy. But the human element, what happened inside the vessel during the preceding minutes, lives only in the imagination of those who study the case. Over the years, as official reports were reviewed and once classified documents began to emerge into the public light, one aspect slowly took shape. Life inside USS Scorpion before its disappearance was not the routine, stable life that many imagined for decades. Behind the military discipline and administrative records, there were subtle signs of wear, hidden tensions, and a complex mix between confidence in technology and the silent recognition that each mission carried with it the permanent risk of an irreparable failure. The submariners of that era lived with a constant duality. On one hand, they were part of a highly trained elite. On the other, they knew that their survival depended on thousands of variables that they could not always control. In later conversations with relatives, fellow servicemen, and retired officers, accounts emerged that portrayed an environment on board where camaraderie was as strong as the operational pressure. Scorpion, like many submarines of its generation, carried small problems that seemed normal within naval routine. Intermittent electrical failures, noises in hydraulic systems, vibrations that sometimes required emergency adjustments. They were not immediate alarm signals, but constant reminders that the vessel was operating at the edge of its capabilities, pressed by a geopolitical context that did not allow for prolonged pauses. The submariners of that time were used to working in an environment where risk was a natural part of the mission. Some former members of the fleet recall that, before departure, Scorpion had reported recurring problems in its propulsion system and several mechanical components. The reports did not suggest imminent danger, but neither did they describe a submarine in optimal condition. The pressures of the Cold War demanded that vessels remain in service even when they were not in ideal shape, and that reality marked every maneuver, every dive, every day at sea. When Scorpion departed for Norfolk in May of 1968, there were no visible indications that the mission would be different from any other. However, some witnesses later recalled that a strange feeling, difficult to describe, seemed to surround the submarine that day. It was not fear, nor a premonition, but rather a mix of accumulated fatigue and a quiet concern about the technical faults that, although not considered critical, added internal tension to the vessel. For the crew, that kind of concern was not rare. But seen in hindsight, it took on a more unsettling nuance. As the ship sailed toward what would be its final destination, the crew followed the established routine. Watches, systems monitoring, internal training, maintenance. In a nuclear submarine, life is organized around the clock and the machinery. The reactor must remain stable. Electrical systems must operate in millimetric harmony. Valves must remain sealed. Any minimal alteration can unleash a chain of consequences that, under the pressure of the deep ocean, can be fatal. That is the silent reality of those who operate underwater. They depend on a perfect balance that does not always respond to human intentions. Years later, when investigators examined every centimeter of the wreckage, they found clues suggesting that internal systems might have experienced problems before the final collapse. Some panels showed signs of prolonged exposure to moisture before the implosion, suggesting small but persistent leaks. Other fragments indicated that certain valves might not have fully closed in the minutes preceding the disaster. None of this could be confirmed with absolute certainty, but it did show a pattern. The tragedy was not a single sudden event, but likely the culmination of a slow, relentless, silent sequence. The acoustic analysis of SOSUS, one of the most debated elements of the case, added another layer of complexity. Specialists who studied the 15 recorded events noted that some sounds had features compatible with internal movement of structures under tension. They were not detonations. They were not external collisions. They were the deep language of steel giving way under pressure that increased without pause. At first, small creaks, then larger structural failures. Finally, the devastating collapse that marked the end of the submarine. That sequence, interpreted with modern technology, suggests that the vessel may have been descending out of control for several minutes, a period during which the crew was probably fighting to regain stability. What might the sailors have thought in those final moments? Was there time to understand the magnitude of the danger? It is impossible to know for sure, but submarine experts agree that if the water ingress was sudden, the crew would have received immediate alerts of loss of buoyancy. It is likely that the officer in charge of depth control ordered maneuvers to stop the descent. Perhaps they tried to alter the submarine's angle to stabilize it. Perhaps they activated bilge pumps that could not keep up with the speed of the flooding. Perhaps, in a final effort, they tried to blow ballast to attempt an emergency ascent. None of those actions could have changed the final outcome if the damage was severe enough. In studies conducted after the discovery, it was determined that the point where the water ingress is believed to have begun was located in an area difficult for the crew to access. If the failure occurred in a valve of the waste disposal system, or in a seal of the hydraulic system, the flooding might have begun in a compartment where sailors would not have had immediate access. That would have complicated any attempt at isolation. The water would have advanced quickly, filling connected spaces, altering the submarine's total weight and compromising its electrical systems. As more compartments gave way, the vessel's maneuvering ability would have diminished until it vanished. Reaction times in a submarine under emergency are extremely short. The pressure of the ocean, even at just a few hundred meters, leaves no margin for error. And once a submarine enters an uncontrolled descent, physics dictates the next minutes. The temperature increases in some compartments, systems begin to fail, the structure starts to creak. Sailors know that those sounds are not normal. They are warnings that time is running out. Pressure travels, pushes, crushes. Lights may flicker, instruments may go dark. The silence becomes dense, sharp. And within that environment, any hope of ascent becomes a calculation that depends more on luck than skill. When the structure of USS Scorpion finally gave way, the force released was so great that the sections separated in a clean, almost mathematical way. The bow, already flooded, partially resisted. The aft section, still full of air and machinery, collapsed in a devastating manner. The remains were scattered over a relatively narrow area of the seabed, indicating that the submarine had descended almost vertically before the final impact. The marks left on the bottom show a short but intense impact path, a straight line of 1 or 2 meters that revealed the exact instant in which the hull ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The story of USS Scorpion does not end with the wreckage or the declassified reports. For years, reviews of the case influenced the design of later submarines, maintenance protocols, the practices of the submarine community, and the way deep-water emergencies are handled. Many modern safety systems, electrical redundancies, reinforced seals and monitoring procedures were born from the conclusions drawn from Scorpion and Thresher. In a way, both submarines became silent teachers for future generations of naval engineers. The Navy, for its part, continued to protect the sinking site as a place of eternal rest. Each visit to the location is not a purely emotionless scientific expedition. It is an act of remembrance, an exercise in respect for those who remained there forever. The scientists who monitor radiation levels know they work on sacred ground. The engineers who review current images know that every fragment of metal was part of the sailors' daily lives. And although pressure and the passage of time have altered the shape of many remains, the presence of Scorpion remains intact in the deep silence of the Atlantic. New technologies have made it possible to create more precise digital models of the collapse. Some recreations show the complete implosion process in thousandths of a second, translating invisible physics into a visual representation. Those simulations have been essential to understanding how minimal variations in density, temperature, or pressure can accelerate collapse. But the most striking aspect of those recreations is not the physical destruction, but the revelation of how a structure that seemed indestructible can disappear so quickly, so completely, so silently. The case of USS Scorpion remains a reminder that even in the modern era, nature continues to be the predominant force. No machine, no matter how sophisticated, can defy the deep ocean indefinitely. Submarines exist in a fragile balance between resistance and pressure, between human control and non-negotiable physics. When that balance breaks, the end is inevitable, but the search for answers is not. And in that sense, Scorpion continues to generate questions half a century after its disappearance. For the families of the crew, the story was never only about a submarine or a structural failure. It was, and still is, about people. About fathers, sons, brothers and friends who lived their final moments in a hostile environment, fulfilling a duty that not many understand and that few would have the courage to assume. These men were part of a tradition that demands sacrifice, discipline, and total dedication to the mission. And although the sea kept their bodies, their names live on in monuments, commemorative plaques, and the memory of those who still feel their absence. With the passage of time, what happened in May of 1968 has become a story that unites science, tragedy, engineering, geopolitics, memory, and silence. A silence that is not empty, but deep, full of meaning, full of voices that can no longer speak, but that remain present through the questions they left unanswered. Over time, researchers understood that the story of USS Scorpion could not be summarized solely in technical reports or analyses of collapsed structures. There was a human component that gave depth to the account, an aspect that was never recorded in military documents, but that manifested in letters sent before sailing, in testimonies from shipmates who shared missions with the crew, and in scattered fragments of conversations held by those who knew closely what life was like in a submarine of the era. Those testimonies, while they do not explain the technical cause of the tragedy, do reveal what it was like to exist inside a world where steel separates life from death by just a few centimeters of thickness. The crew of Scorpion, like that of any submarine of its time, was made up of young men, disciplined and trained to face the total darkness of the ocean. Many were between 20 and 30 years old, some married, others engaged, others just beginning their naval careers. For them, the mission was a natural part of duty. They knew the deep ocean grants no second chances. They knew they must trust their shipmates more than anything else. They also knew that every dive was an encounter with the unknown, even if they hid it beneath the military routine that gives structure to what is, in essence, a daily act of courage. The families, over time, became guardians of the collective memory. They were the ones who kept the small details, the quiet concern of an officer before departure, a hurried phone call, the promise to return soon, the expectation of a celebration yet to come. Those memories turned into disjointed fragments that, together, tell a story parallel to the tragedy. That of a group of men who lived normally in a space where physical and psychological pressure were intertwined in ways difficult to understand for those who have never descended below the surface of the sea. The submarine culture of those years was rigid, proud, demanding. There was no room for mistakes. Emergency systems, though robust, could not cover every possible scenario. Skipjack-class submarines, like Scorpion, were fast and maneuverable, but limited by the technology of their time. System redundancy was lower than in later generations. Sensors were less precise. Communication with the surface was limited. Automation was reduced. This meant that any failure required a direct, immediate response from the crew. A faulty valve was not just a technical problem. It was a battle against an ocean intent on devouring the vessel. That reality became more evident when Scorpion's maintenance records were analyzed. Some documents, released after long public pressure, showed that several systems had been classified as operational but not optimal. They were not critical failures, but signs suggesting wear that was progressing faster than expected. Small leaks, electrical fluctuations, sensors that occasionally required recalibration. Those problems, taken together, might have created the exact combination of circumstances that triggered the disaster. Some naval investigators of the time, and also contemporary ones, focused attention on the waste disposal system, a conduit connected directly to the exterior of the submarine. If that piece failed, water could enter with a force that would make any containment attempt impossible. Later analyses found that on other submarines of the same class, the system's valve had shown corrosion or leakage under certain pressure conditions. If something similar occurred on Scorpion, the initial sequence of the disaster might have begun without triggering an obvious alarm, allowing water to seep in progressively until the situation became uncontrollable. The internal dynamics of a submarine under flooding are particularly dangerous. As water enters a compartment, the submarine's trim can change. If the water accumulates in the lower part, the boat pitches forward or aft, depending on where the leak is. This affects maneuverability and can cause the vessel to enter an angle that accelerates its descent. If the ballast system cannot compensate for the increased weight, the submarine becomes heavier than the surrounding water, initiating a descent that can only be stopped if enough air is expelled or the leak is sealed in time. Experts who studied the acoustic record suspect that this is exactly what happened. A gradual loss of buoyancy, followed by an increase in descent speed. SOSUS detected events that might represent internal adjustments, movements of structures, or even attempts by the crew to correct the trajectory. But once the submarine passed a certain point, pressure became an insurmountable enemy. The speed of descent increased, the structure began to strain, and the recorded sounds reflect how the hull was weakening before giving way completely. Beyond the technical explanation, the tragedy of Scorpion began to take on a symbolic character. For many sailors, it represented the inherent vulnerability of submarine service. It was a devastating proof that even in an age of technological advancement and nuclear capability, the ocean remained a superior force. The concept of the invulnerability of nuclear submarines, which many civilians imagined, vanished before the evidence that a minimal failure could turn a steel machine into sea dust in just a few seconds. The decades that followed also gave space for the emergence of alternative theories. Some claimed that the submarine had been following or being followed by a Soviet vessel. Others suggested the accidental detonation of a torpedo, armed with defective mechanisms. Others went further and proposed invisible collisions. But none of those hypotheses withstood the physical analysis of the wreckage. The shape of the hull, the pressure marks, the relative integrity of the bow, the absence of deformations typical of an explosion. Everything pointed to a single type of event, implosion due to excess depth. However, the fundamental question remains open. What caused the initial descent? And perhaps that question will never have an answer, because the ocean, as in so many human stories, destroyed the first pages of the chapter needed to reconstruct the origin. Only the end remained, recorded in compressed steel and in 15 acoustic signals captured from thousands of kilometers away. In the memorials dedicated to Scorpion, the names of the 99 crew members are inscribed not as victims, but as members of a community that confronts the impossible with discipline and resolve. Many of them were experts in electronics, navigation, nuclear propulsion, and hydraulic systems. Their skills were indispensable for keeping the machine alive underwater. These men did not just operate a submarine, they also cared for it, kept it breathing, ensured that every component fulfilled its purpose. And in the final minutes, though it cannot be known, it is possible to imagine that they did everything within their power to prevent the catastrophe. When USNS Mizar found the wreckage, the investigators were faced with a reality that cannot be measured with technology. The enormous sense of emptiness when seeing the evidence of a tragedy that unfolded in absolute silence, under kilometers of water, far from any possible help. The cameras showed a world never before seen by human eyes. A submarine delicately arranged by pressure on the seabed, fragmented yet still recognizable. It was a steel ode to the fragility of humanity before the vastness of the ocean. Structural analysis still continues today in technical circles. Each new tool, each new simulation, each new interpretation adds fragments, but does not change the nature of the outcome. The initial cause remains a partial mystery, but the end is defined with absolute clarity. USS Scorpion succumbed to the ocean, not to an enemy, not to an explosion, not to a deliberate human act. And that certainty, although incomplete, is the foundation upon which the memory of the tragedy has been built. As time passed, the story of USS Scorpion began to explore dimensions that had not been considered before. What initially was seen as a simple technical disaster acquired a broader character, a portrait of how the American military machine functioned in the midst of the Cold War, how decisions were made under pressure, how secrecy was prioritized over clarity, and how these factors intertwined deeply with the lives of those assigned to operate underwater. The tragedy did not occur in a vacuum. It was the result of a context where strategic urgency, international rivalry, and technological limitations fused into an atmosphere that demanded more from the sailors than any human being could sustain for long. Those who have studied the historical archives in depth note that, in the days leading up to Scorpion's disappearance, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at a delicate point. Submarines from both sides patrolled the Atlantic like moving pieces on a silent chessboard. Acoustic surveillance was intense. Movements were measured. Any unusual pattern could be interpreted as a hostile act. That environment of permanent suspicion shaped not only foreign policy, but also the internal culture of the crews. Living in a submarine at that time meant taking part in a war that was rarely seen, but always felt. The mindset on board Scorpion was influenced by that strategic pressure. Unlike surface ships, a submarine operates practically isolated from the world for most of its mission. Communication is limited, delayed, and filtered. Sailors learn to disconnect from external time, to live in artificial cycles, to measure their lives in watch rotations, machinery sounds, checklist reviews, and decisions that must be made calmly even when the smallest system emits a sound different from the usual. That constant state of reasoned alert shapes the psychology of submariners in a way that few outside that world can fully understand. Accounts collected from former submariners of the same era offer a more intimate view of how a crew operated in emergency situations. All agree that, although training prepares for almost everything, the ocean has ways of presenting itself that never fully reveal themselves. Sometimes a simple change in water density alters the way a submarine responds to controls. At other times, an unexpected vibration in a shaft can induce fear, not because of what is happening at that moment, but because of what could happen in the next few minutes if the anomaly grows. The crew of Scorpion undoubtedly experienced dozens of situations of uncertainty before May of 1968, but none comparable to what awaited them in their final moments. The subsequent investigation, in attempting to reconstruct those final moments, was also forced to consider the human dimension of the disaster. Although no direct record survived the implosion, experts have proposed possible scenarios based on the submarine's operating logic. If the first signs of water ingress manifested as unusual noises, unexpected descent, or anomalies in electrical systems, the officers in command would have immediately begun a rapid analysis to determine the cause. Trained submariners develop a sort of technical intuition. They can identify the nature of a failure by the vibration they feel in the deck, by the way a light flickers, by the tone of a motor changing just a few hertz. If the flooding advanced into areas where essential electrical panels were located, it is likely that some control lights failed abruptly. The mix of semi-darkness, electrical hums, and metal under strain can be extremely disturbing in the depths of the ocean. Even experienced sailors describe that kind of environment as one of the most difficult to face because it is there that the total vulnerability of machine and man becomes evident. Any attempt to seal the compartment would have depended on how quickly the source of the leak was identified, but structural analysis suggests that the water ingress occurred in a place that complicated or prevented acting in time. Specialists in immersion dynamics have pointed out that the submarine's behavior in the final minutes probably changed abruptly. If water entered a central compartment, the weight would have been concentrated in a critical area that altered trim and overall stability. When a submarine loses vertical control, even by a few degrees, the descent can become exponential. It is likely that the crew tried to counteract that effect using ballast systems and angle adjustments. But if the electrical system was compromised, those controls may have failed simultaneously. Once the descent reached a speed greater than what internal systems could compensate for, the submarine entered a regime known in engineering as a lost trajectory. That term describes the moment when a submerged vehicle can no longer recover stability, no matter what the crew does. The SOSUS analysis reinforces this theory, as the recorded sounds indicate a period of progressive collapse before total failure. Some acoustic events suggest that internal parts of the structure began to deform before the hull gave way. Those creaks are not explosions, but signs of metal under pressure that has become unbearable. Over the years, the Navy has tried to support the families in their grief, but the absence of a definitive cause remains a heavy burden to carry. Some found comfort in knowing that death was instantaneous and that the sailors did not suffer the agony of a slow end. Others, however, feel that uncertainty is a form of ongoing suffering, as if the sea had kept an essential part of the story that should have returned to the surface. Military psychology experts point out that submarine disasters have an emotional dimension that is particularly hard to process because there are no bodies, no recovered remains, no possible physical farewell. The submarine becomes a sealed, inaccessible, permanent mausoleum. For the families, that means mourning takes longer to complete. For the Navy, it means assuming a sustained commitment to care for and respect the site. For the investigators, it means accepting that not all questions can be answered, even with the most advanced technology. One of the most striking elements of the new analyses is the understanding of how the ocean turns a disaster into a silent time capsule. Deep currents, much slower than those on the surface, have kept Scorpion's remains in a state of relative stability. The bow retains its general shape. Some external instruments remain attached to the hull. Certain pieces appear frozen at the exact moment of impact. That cold stillness, that movementless permanence, brings a sense of solemnity that even the most experienced engineers describe as overwhelming. In modern simulations, engineers have studied not only the collapse of the hull, but also the acoustic behavior inside the submarine in the moments before the end. Although it is impossible to know exactly what sounds the crew heard, models suggest an environment where the creaking of metal machinery impacts, interrupted electrical hums, and hull vibrations would have created a deep and chaotic soundscape. That chaos is not explosively loud, but dense, sharp, close. In an enclosed space, every sound is amplified, every vibration is felt through the deck. Every failure seems to come from everywhere at once. The submarine community has kept Scorpion's memory alive through stories passed orally across generations. In academies, technical schools, and training centers, the case is used as an example not only of engineering, but of professional humility. It is taught that even the most advanced systems can fail, that technical inspection must be exhaustive, that confidence must never turn into complacency. Veteran submariners often repeat a phrase that sums up this philosophy: the sea does not forgive. And Scorpion has become the most profound illustration of that truth. The case also led to major changes in how risk assessments for submarine missions are carried out. After Scorpion, the Navy implemented stricter protocols for verifying critical systems, strengthened redundancy of certain valves, redesigned isolation mechanisms, and improved the quality of materials used in internal structures. Naval engineering learned, painfully, that deep water pressure demands a level of perfection that no other military machine requires. The improvements were not only technical, but also psychological. Training programs began to include more demanding simulations of high-pressure emergencies. Medical and emotional screening of crew members was strengthened. Internal communication was improved. It became understood that human beings, even in tightly controlled environments, need emotional tools to face extreme risk. Although no change can undo the tragedy of Scorpion, it did transform the way the limits between technology and nature are understood. The deep ocean remains one of the most mysterious spaces on the planet, an environment where pressure is so immense that it turns any mistake into an immediate end. Operating there is a challenge that combines science, discipline, courage, and a humble recognition that no machine is invincible. USS Scorpion is still there, in silence, on a dark seabed where time passes without leaving traces. Its remains tell an incomplete yet powerful story. A story of courage, mystery, engineering, and memory. A story that reminds us that, even in the nuclear age, the sea maintains its supremacy. As the years went by, and the case files began to circulate among historians, engineers, and submarine warfare specialists, a notion emerged that transformed the way the disaster was interpreted. Scorpion was not only an isolated loss, but also a mirror of its time, a faithful reflection of a world trapped between dizzying technological progress and human limitations. What outwardly appeared to be just a naval failure ended up revealing deep layers of how American military power operated during a period in which the rush to stay ahead of the enemy was stronger than technical caution. In that context, submarine missions had become more frequent, riskier, and more demanding. Each deployment at sea was an opportunity for intelligence gathering, acoustic tracking, tactical observation, and strategic deployment. Submarines did not sail solely according to routine protocols. They sailed within a silent war that was never openly declared, but that defined every maneuver. The crews knew this. They knew that every unknown sound could be a threat. They knew that every transmission could be intercepted. They knew that any anomaly, no matter how small, had the potential to become a point of no return. Scorpion was part of that logic. Its previous mission had included tracking Soviet vessels. Although many details remain classified, declassified records suggest that the crew operated under a higher than usual level of tension. Some retired officers mentioned that the routes assigned to Scorpion were particularly sensitive, located in areas where the Soviet Union had an active presence. That meant the submarine had to operate in maximum silence, with no room for maneuvers that could reveal its presence. Under those circumstances, any technical failure was even more delicate, as it not only compromised the ship's safety, but also its invisibility. More recent investigations have suggested that part of Scorpion's accumulated wear and tear may have been an indirect consequence of these intense missions. The internal machinery, constantly pushed to maintain adequate speeds or to execute abrupt depth changes during strategic missions, could have suffered stresses that were never officially recorded. Even small changes in the alignment of the propulsion shaft could generate vibrations that, over time, weakened structures already pushed to their limits. The testimony of a petty officer who had previously sailed on Scorpion revealed a troubling detail. Weeks before its final mission, the submarine had experienced an abnormal vibration in the engineering section. Although it was inspected and apparently corrected, the recurrent nature of the problem suggested that there was greater wear at some point in the propulsion system. This kind of vibration, though seemingly manageable, could transmit unexpected stresses to critical components, especially if the submarine had to perform rapid descents or ascents during strategic missions. Modern naval engineering understands that even tiny failures can be amplified under the extreme conditions of the deep ocean. An imperceptibly worn joint can allow water ingress. A slightly corroded cable can fail when an emergency valve is activated. A pipe with a corroded spot can rupture as pressure increases. Submarines live at the edge of physics. They are designed to hold back an environment that seeks to crush them with the force of tens of thousands of tons. The slightest crack in that barrier is enough to reverse the balance. When engineers studied the material recovered from Scorpion and compared its condition with that of similar submarines, they found a pattern. The most affected areas were those exposed to permanent stress from daily operation. They were not failures evident from the surface, but scars accumulated over hundreds of maneuvers. That kind of deterioration can only be understood by contemplating the entire life of a submarine, not just its final mission. And in that broader analysis, Scorpion shows signs of having carried a technical burden that perhaps was not fully recognized at the time. Meanwhile, the US Navy continued to monitor the sinking site. Dives carried out decades later showed that the hull's destruction followed a clear physical logic, but also revealed that the marine environment had accepted the remains as part of its own landscape. The bow, still recognizable, was partially covered by sediment. The aft section, more fragmented, was almost unrecognizable, transformed into a collection of compressed steel sheets that seemed like part of the terrain. Some elements, such as internal supports or bases of hydraulic systems, remained anchored to the sea floor, though without a clear shape. One recurring observation by those who have studied the most recent images is the site's apparent serenity. There are no signs of disturbance, no strong currents that have displaced the remains, no massive accumulations of marine life altering the scene. It is a quiet place, almost suspended in time, where silence is absolute. A silence that becomes even more meaningful when one understands that in that very spot, more than half a century ago, an event took place that released a destructive force comparable to a colossal implosion of energy. Researchers who have had access to the area describe a particular feeling when observing Scorpion's remains. It is not fear, nor curiosity, nor even sadness in the conventional sense. It is a mix of deep respect and an understanding of human smallness before the power of the ocean. There, at that exact point in the Atlantic, physical laws asserted their supremacy definitively. No technology in the world could have saved the submarine once its final descent began. And that recognition, for many experts, is what makes the study of Scorpion so complex and at the same time so essential. Over the years, the public narrative around Scorpion also changed. What was initially perceived as an almost impenetrable mystery gradually became a case studied from multiple angles: engineering, geopolitics, military psychology, submarine forensic analysis, strategic ethics. Each contributed a different piece of the puzzle. But even when all those pieces are added together, the final result remains incomplete. The exact cause of the initial event, what triggered the descent, remains an empty space at the center of the story, a point that no document or analysis can fully fill. That uncertainty has inspired multiple academic efforts to try to understand the incomprehensible. Some researchers have devoted entire years to studying similar failures in other submarines. Others have developed advanced models that simulate the behavior of hulls under extreme stress. Others have tried to reconstruct the chronology of Scorpion's final minutes using only the acoustic data. All these efforts, no matter how precise, always end at the same point. The first link in the chain is missing. Without it, only what came after can be reconstructed. The changes implemented by the Navy after the accidents of Scorpion and Thresher marked a before and after in the history of nuclear submarines. The SubSafe initiative, created to guarantee the maximum integrity of the vessels, raised engineering and maintenance standards to levels that had not existed before. Today, many consider those measures to be the reason later submarines have been able to operate for decades without similar incidents. In a sense, Scorpion, in its silence, saved future lives. Its sacrifice is remembered not only for its tragedy, but also for its legacy. Despite modern improvements, the main lesson remains intact. The deep ocean is still a realm that does not tolerate errors. Pressure is absolute, darkness total, distance from the surface immense. life inside a submarine is daily coexistence with an invisible boundary between safety and destruction. And that boundary, in the case of Scorpion, was broken irrevocably. Today, when maritime historians analyze Scorpion's story, they often describe it as one of the most complete and incomplete narratives at the same time. Complete in its outcome, its physics, its wreckage, its acoustic timeline. Incomplete in its origin, its first failure, in that initial instant that was lost forever hundreds of meters beneath the sea.